Hello, welcome to World Civilizations Since 1500. Now, today we're starting the third session of the fourth topic titled The Age of Revolutions. And in this session, we're going to continue looking at part three, and that is the economic revolutions that transpired between the 15 and 1800s that gave rise to both capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, something we looked at quite thoroughly in the past session, in the second session, in the second session. So just to recap quite quickly here, what we discussed so far, and that is we see the emergence of an entirely new system that is rapidly replacing feudalism and to a certain degree mercantilism. Again, the old feudal order in which people organize themselves along what is called clientage or patron-client relationships. People actually laboring for a landlord in return for protection, paying tribute. That system is quickly coming to an end and is being replaced by a new system in which now the economy is reorganized in a way that we see individuals earning the right to own property. Again, the economy is moving towards the market. This is a market-oriented economy in which people will be allowed to own property in order to generate wealth from enterprise. Of course, society demands a host of different products, essential items or luxury items, and people are now about to produce them, manufacture them, to sell it on the market for profit. Okay. And within the system, we also see the introduction of wage labor. Again, this is really the essence of capitalism. Again, it's a system based on private property, free enterprise, and also wage labor. Those that do not have the capital to start a business will be selling their labor for a wage. And what we see is the process of industrialization. If we can just go to our outline here, we were looking at the machine age, the introduction of new technologies, machinery, in which more and more the production of goods will be done through the assistance of different kinds of machineries, again, that are invented in England. Again, so this is really the home of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. This is what we see the rise of those two systems simultaneously, that together, again, is just referred as industrial capitalism. Again, so we see great changes on the rise in England. We see factories, we see new machinery replacing human labor. We see the peasantry transforming into the first industrial working class, and we see the rise of large industrial cities. Again, so within this change, we're also going to see other kinds of machinery innovated for the purpose of mobilizing resources, industrial resources. In this case, it was required to innovate, again, industrial sized machines in order to transfer loads and loads of minerals and raw materials from one area to another, because, again, using animals for that purpose was not really practical. Again, it was very, very limiting. So we see certain innovations in England. We see the development of, for example, the iron and steel industries. Those are on the rise. And as a result of the iron and steel industries, we're going to see the development of transportation systems, modern transportation, mechanized transportation systems. This is, again, happening when in Britain, engineers or scientists, they create a new kind of engine. It's called the steam engine. It was called the Watts steam engine that will be used to propel things like, for example, railroads and steamboats. Again, so this is also revolutionizing transportation. Those kinds of transportation systems were greatly needed in order to, once again, transport materials, raw materials, whether we're talking about coal or iron ore or manufactured goods, textiles, for example, equipment, and even populations. Again, this is going to revolutionize transportation, um, not only within England, but worldwide. Now, it is extremely important to note that the rise of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution is arising in England. This is the home, if you will, of this new system. And out of England, that system is going to be spreading around the world. Now, the question is, however, why is it that England succeeded, so to speak, in creating a whole new economy and a new mode of production that was mechanized, in other words? If you look at England, again, those are just islands, tiny islands that succeeded in doing this dramatic transformation in the economy and also in industry. Whereas, let's say, in other parts of the world, there were other societies that were also quite advanced in manufacturing, for example, and they really had the largest economies, as a matter of fact, much, much larger than all of Europe put together. So we need a global context. Let me provide an analysis of how this transformation occurred so we can draw a comparison, a comparative analysis, in other words, of the Industrial Revolution worldwide. For example, when we look at India, India possessed the second largest economy in the world. The first, largest economy in the world was China by far, and India was a close second. And something we covered in the past with the rise of the trading empires, when the British and the French established trading outposts, for example, in different parts of the Indian subcontinent, one of the items that India was exporting to Europe through those trading companies that both Britain and France established, those East India companies we looked at, were textiles. Okay, India had been growing cotton for hundreds and hundreds of years. It was really of a high quality, as a matter of fact. And due to the growing demand in Europe for Indian textiles, we see the development of Indian manufacturing on a grand scale. We looked at that in the past, how villages, entire communities and villages, for example, were turned into manufacturing bases. Now, the type of manufacturing that was taking place in India was not the kind of mechanized production that we saw, for example, in England as we move into the 1700s. Okay, so it was still done manually. Those were actually, artisans weaving by hand, and it was still done the old way, the old-fashioned way, again, manually. But again, they employed a lot of labor. It was labor intensive, and they had, of course, large populations that participated in that kind of activity. So they are indeed building their own manufacturing base, and it's all geared for exports. And again, there's a high demand for those textiles, and they were high quality, and they were able to actually offer those textiles at low price as well. Okay, they are the ones growing the cotton there in those regions and manufacturing. Again, so they were still making a profit, despite the fact that they were actually selling the product at a low price. Now, the other factor that launched India, so to speak, to the world stage as a highly successful manufacturing society was the fact that they also had plenty of land as well. And the Indian subcontinent is, of course, gigantic territorially, and their system of agriculture was also highly productive at the same time. So they were not really bumping into geographical constraints, so to speak. They had, of course, available land, very productive, very fertile, plenty of rainfall, and they were able to sustain large populations to their agricultural systems. So this is, again, kind of explains the reasons why they had the second largest economy. Not only because they were exporting textiles, which was very important, but also because they were exporting other products, particularly tea and also spices, particularly black pepper. And that's part of the Indian success, so to speak. So they were really, again, experiencing an economic boom. But one of the reasons why they lagged behind was due to the fact that their manufacturing, as I mentioned, was still done the old way, the old-fashioned way. It was manual, if you will. Whereas Great Britain was innovating, for example, the steam engine. And this is really, again, an engine in which people burn coal. And what the coal is doing is it is really vaporizing water in a boiler, and through the pressure again of the steam, you propel pistons that move railroads or steamboats, for example. But ultimately, that kind of technology will be applied also to textile manufacturing. Yeah, the weaving machines are going to be propelled also by the use of steam power. So this accelerated production many, many fold. So this is one of the advantages of technology, of modern technology, mechanized technology, and that is that you can maximize production, make it more efficient. And you can overwhelm competitors that do not possess that kind of technology. Okay, and so the Indian manufacturers will be overwhelmed by British manufacturing. Now, that was not the whole story. That was part of it. The other part of the story is that Great Britain, as we move into the 1700s, as they're building their first factories, for example, and they're moving towards textile manufacturing as well, they felt the need to protect their own domestic industries from other competitors. And so one way to protect British industries was to ban imports of Indian textiles in Britain itself. And then, again, that was something that British Parliament passed in 1707. They had to pass a law in order to make the British people buy the domestic product as opposed to importing it, in other words. Okay? And when you do that, you foster internal development. You benefit your own industries at the expense of others, for example. And so you erect barriers, in other words, a protective shield, if you will, from your rivals that are also producing similar textiles. And again, this is something that the British is now beginning to do. As we'll see in the next topic, when we look at, for example, European colonialism, the British will go a step further, in that they're not just going to ban the imports of Indian textiles at some point. As they're moving into the proper colonization of India by the mid part of the 1700s, they're going to take over. In other words, Indian production of cotton, for example, and they will be in control also of that industry within India itself. So, that kind of explains why the British are going to succeed versus uh, other societies, and that is, again, other societies are not mechanizing, and they're being at the same time slowly but surely um, colonized, by the European powers, in this case, Great Britain. Okay. Now, China had the largest economy in the world still as we move into the 16 and even into the 1700s, by far. It was an economy that was geared both to supply the needs of its domestic markets. Okay. There is, of course, within China, uh, demand for a host of different products, whether we're talking about food products, grains, for example, wheat, rice, textiles, for instance, pottery, porcelain, for example, Chinese porcelain, um, spices, and the like. And again, this is an economy that is trying to both fulfill its internal markets, the need for its internal demands, but also to maximize exports as much as possible. And as a matter of fact, China had a kind of policy for hundreds and hundreds of years geared towards the outside. It's an export-led economy, trying to limit as much as possible the import of foreign goods and maximize the exports. Okay. And this is pretty much the kind of formula that they followed that gave them really uh, the largest economy in the world. Okay. It kind of rendered that kind of result. Now, China understands very well that the textile industry is booming. We looked at that as the Europeans are entering the Indian Ocean, for example. There's a growing demand for textiles. There's also, again, African textiles. We looked at that as well when we looked at West Africa, for example. They're also exporting massive quantities of textiles to Europe as well. So this is a booming industry, so to speak, in different parts of the world. And China doesn't want to lag behind. Now, they don't want to import any textiles. As a matter of fact, they want to develop their own textile industry, and they want to place that industry in the hands of the people, particularly the peasantry, which constitute the vast majority of China's population. Overwhelmingly, again, over 90% of China's population is made up of peasants, in other words. Okay. And so, again, by the 15 and 1600s, China is really developing a kind of rural industrialization in which the idea was to place in the hands of the people in their own homes the capacity for them to manufacture textiles and supply the internal market. Again, whether they're supplying the needs of their own communities or their own provinces or the entire Chinese empire as a whole. Again, so the peasants are doing this at home again. Something similar to what happened in England with the outwork system. You know, we talked about that, at the end of session 2. So this is, again, extremely important to understand that China is really trying to uh, foster the development of their own industry. They are trying to supply their own markets. They're trying to really engage in massive public works projects, and they are trying to build an agricultural base within China for China to be totally self-sufficient and to also maximize exports. So they're growing, again, rice, cotton, for example, maximize also the production of silks and also sugarcane. At the same time, they are engaged in water transportation development, and particularly again along the major rivers of China, the Yellow River, the Yangtze River, and create tributaries in order to reach out into the different towns, communities of China for merchants to have access to those markets as well. As the peasants will be producing those crops and the textiles, they want, once again, the merchants to have access to every single community possible. Okay. So, once again, textile manufacturing is now on the rise in China. It is taking place in the countryside for the most part. Does that mean that the largest cities of China are not engaged in this process? No, they are engaged in this process. Okay. And perhaps that was one of the weaknesses of the system, and that is that this is not a highly centralized type of industrial development that is taking place. It's very decentralized because while the largest cities of China are producing textiles, well, more often than not, those textiles are going to be bought, consumed in that region within the city itself. So the merchants of the cities are not going to have access to the entire, you know, national market, so to speak. Because in the countryside, in the rural areas, we see the peasants also engage in manufacturing and they're going to be controlling their own regional markets as well. So once again, it's very, very decentralized. Okay. Despite that weakness, China does not necessarily sees that necessarily as a disadvantage, as an obstacle. As a matter of fact, they consider this system to be highly productive and greatly needed because this is going to prevent the imports of textiles from other trading empires. Okay. They don't want to depend, in other words, they don't want to be importing textiles from anybody else. They want to be self-sufficient. So again, this was part of an internal project called the self-sufficient industrialization. Totally self-sufficient, that they are producing their own product. Okay, they're engaging in industrialization, but again, without any dependence from the outside. Now, just like India, the main issue here is that all of this manufacturing is also conducted in the old-fashioned way. It's not necessarily mechanized the way we see it, for example, in Great Britain. It's largely done by artisans, they're weaving by hand, and so on. So there's a certain limitation to that in that, well, you're not going to be engaging in mass production, for example. Okay. So see that as perhaps a great disadvantage, versus the British model that is mechanized, of course. They can overwhelm your market in the future. Not now, but later on, as we'll see, of course, uh, European industry, starting with the British, of course, will be mass producing to the point that they're going to be moving into the outside and trying to export as much as possible to the world, trying to open up markets, for example, outside of Europe to absorb the excesses of the growing industries in Europe, which will lead, of course, to colonialism, something we're going to discuss, of course, much later in the next topic. Now, China runs into certain problems, and that is overpopulation. Okay. So, as we're moving now into the 1600s, for example, China's population is growing dramatically. It's now over 200 million people, okay, way over that. And what that meant is that now this booming population is bumping up against certain geographical constraints, and that is land. Now, that doesn't mean that China lacks land necessarily, but in order to make room for more communities and for more agricultural fields, well, you need to clear forests, for example. Okay. So as the forests of China are cleared to make room for more agriculture, you're at the same time, decimating your only uh, source of fuel, which is wood. Again, so the scarcity of land, for example, and the cutting down of forests in China will be perhaps one of the weaknesses, again, of this empire in terms of trying to achieve a successful industrial revolution. They're just doing away with the only source of energy slowly but surely. And energy is critical for any industrial revolution, as a matter of fact. And this is something that the British had at their disposal in great quantities. The success story of Great Britain was perhaps accidental in that the difference between Great Britain and what we talk, for example, India and China, is that Great Britain, when we look at the 15 and 1600s, had at their disposal two things that served as great catalysts for their industrial development, and those were colonies in America and coal, a new source of fuel. And again, coal is going to be instrumental for British industrialization. Okay, so let's talk about how colonies and coal served as great aids in the British Industrial Revolution. Well, remember that China had an overpopulation issue. Again, they're already facing geographical constraints. The British were also facing geographical constraints, by the way. Those are islands, by the way. And the British population was also growing. But the fact that America, the continent, was discovered by Europeans and colonized by Europeans, and we see the process of settlement and colonization by different European kingdoms, including Great Britain, that served like a certain relief valve, so to speak, for the internal pressures within Europe, the overcrowdedness, if you will, that you can release that pressure by engaging in the massive transfer of populations into the new world. There's going to be plenty of land. Again, this is what Great Britain is doing when they're, sending colonists, for example, settlers to North America, including, of course, a couple of islands they're going to acquire in the 1600s in the Caribbean basin. So again, they had that advantage. Again, the American continent, and the American continent will be almost like an extension of Europe. From an economic perspective. Again, the American continent was an extension of the European economy, again, ultimately. So we have that, again, that kind of advantage. Now, of course, the colonists will demand certain manufactured goods. The colonies will be producing raw materials. Furs, for example, lumber, fish, cotton, rice, indigo, sugar, okay, for the British Empire. But the colonists demanded certain goods that only Great Britain provided. So one of those goods were, of course, textiles, cotton textiles. So this, in turn, is going to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain because they had, of course, an important market to fulfill, an important market that is going to absorb a great number of goods manufactured in Great Britain. So again, this is really leading to British manufacturing. Again, the development of colonies. And of course, when it comes to food production, likewise, the colonies served also as an important outlet for food products that could not be grown in the British Isles. Again, something that China was already facing, that problem, again, of food production, the availability of land and so on, the cutting down of forests, etc. All of that, again, was part of the constrictions of the geography that they were running against. Great Britain is not facing that problem because in the colonies you can also produce food to be exported to Britain to feed the British subjects, in other words. Okay. Now, the other advantage of the colonies for Great Britain was the silver that was transferred from the Americas to Europe. All right, this is something that the Spanish, for example, are transferring. They're transferring from Mexico, from South America, and those mines we talked about, for example, and that led to the silver revolution in Europe. Slowly but surely, silver is flooding the European economy and will become the standard currency in Europe. Again, so for the first time, we're going to see a standard currency continentally, again, across Europe. Now, even though Spain is importing the silver into Spain proper, the fact is that the Spaniards are subcontracting, so to speak, other societies to manufacture what the Spanish colonists needed. In other words, so instead of Spain developing their own manufacturing base and their own industries, they were actually importing manufactured goods from Holland and from Great Britain in order to supply their own Spanish colonies with those products. So that added, once again, to the expansion of British manufacturing because they were manufacturing also for the Spanish, and they were getting paid with silver at the same time. So we're going to see an influx also of silver into England as well as they're manufacturing for other European powers. With this silver coming into the British economy, that silver will serve as capital. So again, this is going to explain why capitalism is going to flourish in England. The rise of capitalism, because there's the rise now of currency, money, merchants are accumulating it, and they're going to use this accumulated capital to invest it in the formation of commercial enterprises. For example, buying up land for wool production, in shipping industries, for transportation services, and so on, cattle ranching, commercial agriculture, and of course, factories. So even the factories themselves, something we talked about earlier, were built through this silver revolution that it was taking place. Those investors, in other words, they had capital, they had silver, and they use it in order to buy up machinery and establish factories, again, in Great Britain. Colonies also were instrumental in providing the British with added wealth, added capital, particularly when the British entered the sugar industry and also the slave trade. Okay. So both slavery and the sugar industry were also critical in the development of the British Industrial Revolution and also the rise of capitalism. In the 1600s, for example, the British acquired colonies from Spain, Barbados in 1624, and Jamaica in 1665. Okay? And they're growing sugar. And sugar is becoming highly profitable in the world market. It was called white gold, as a matter of fact. People were paying silver, they were paying gold for it. And it's something you can trade again for those precious metals. Now, the sugar plantations were not just agricultural enterprises whereby the British were growing sugar for exports. Those sugar plantations in Barbados and in Jamaica were really agricultural factories. Okay. And so even before the establishment of factories in England, the textile factories, the very first factories were those agricultural factories, the sugar plantations, those sugar plantation factories, because in those sugar plantations, people were not just growing sugarcane. They were also at the same time processing the sugarcane into finished products. So again, they will harvest the sugarcane, and after that, they will extract the sugar from the sugarcane, thereby creating raw sugar. They were at the same time investing in presses, again, in order to press the sugarcane and extract the sap or the syrup from the sugarcane, thereby creating molasses. That's another manufactured good. And they're also investing in barrels, for example, to ferment the sugarcane and create rum. So again, this is a kind of factory. And you're producing different products. There's manufacturing taking place. There's technologies, for example. And sugar was a great success in the world economy to the point that, again, there was a worldwide demand for it. So there was an insatiable demand for sugar. So we see here an industry that was really becoming the forerunner of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, a highly profitable enterprise that has a global market. You can supply the demand of the global market, and you're moving into the market to make a profit. And at the same time, you're developing machinery in order to, manufacture different kinds of byproducts of the sugar. Thereby, you're kind of initiating also a kind of industrial revolution in its own right. Again, it's really, the forerunner of the factory, in other words. And sugar will become, as we move into the 16 and 1700s, the very first mass consumer product is consumed worldwide. So again, the British had at their disposal a market that was global, and they were trying to produce for the world. And they were not the only ones. Again, the Portuguese were doing that also in Brazil. The Spaniards, they were doing that in Central America and the Caribbean islands as well. The French also in places like, New Orleans, as we'll see, and Haiti. Again, so there are others, of course, that are also participating. But again, what this means is that this product, this cash crop, is being exported around the world. And this is something that is consumed globally by all people, all ages, regardless of, nationality, regardless of religion and caste and, age. Again, this is something that was consumed globally. And it was really, again, opening up a new world. Sugar production, the sugar industry really was the forerunner of capitalism worldwide. And it's a mass consumer product, something you can produce on a massive scale and still make a profit. So again, this is a product that is, becoming part and parcel of the growing capitalist economies of scale, for example. What is an economy of scale? Again, an economy of scale is one in which you produce something in such a great number, great volumes, and still are making large profits. And sugar was precisely that kind of product, that no matter how much you will produce it, you will always find a market and still make a profit. In other words, and it's an economy of scale. And this will become part of the norm of this new phase in world history called capitalism. Again, and you add machinery, of course, you save, of course, human labor to a certain degree, because with machines, you can replace human labor and you can, at the same time, lower prices. That was part of the formula for the economy of scale. You add technology, and you're able to lower the prices because you're at the same time, saving at least partially part of the investment in labor, not entirely, because at the same time, you still have to use labor for the production of sugar. And this is where slavery comes in. Okay, that the British entered the slave trade. They're moving into West Africa. They form their own slave companies. It's called the Royal African Company in the 1660s, and they're bringing their own slaves to Barbados and Jamaica to grow sugar. So again, they're really cutting all kinds of costs in terms of the labor needed to grow the sugar cane because they're using slaves, in other words. And so both slavery and the sugar industry help finance British industrialization. This was a highly lucrative, highly profitable, in other words, industry that was profitable precisely because it was done through slave labor on one hand, and it was a highly profitable also crop that had a worldwide demand that was insatiable at the same time. So all the capital moving into the British economy by both the slave trade and also the sugar trade, again, help create the kind of wealth, the kind of capital that was invested in the formation of factories and technologies like railroads, for example, and steamboats, canals, steel plants, and the like. That's where the financing was coming from, in other words. Okay. Now, as the British are making deals with the African kingdoms of the West Coast, as they're going there in order to pursue labor, in other words, slaves, to grow the sugar in the New World, the African kingdoms demanded manufactured goods from the British. They weren't paid with gold. They were not really functioning under the gold standard. The African kingdoms, they were actually exporting the gold. They had a lot of gold. Okay. They were exporting slaves, gold, textiles, peppers, ivory, for example. And they demanded certain goods that they valued from the British. So this also enhanced British manufacturing because as the British were trying to acquire the slaves, they needed to bring into West Africa manufactured goods, iron works, for example, uh, muskets, guns, gunpowder, including alcohol and tobacco, that the West African kingdoms demanded. So this spurred development in Great Britain of a manufacturing base, again, that they needed to engage in manufacturing in order to obtain the needed slaves for the sugar industry. That was at the same time bringing in the capital to continue fostering industrialization. So that kind of became like a cycle, so to speak, inside of Britain. Now, coal was also part of the success story of the British. The British were also facing an energy crisis. They were cutting down forests in order to manufacture, things like iron tools, etc., and to heat up homes and cook meals and the like. So as they're devastating forests, they run into an energy problem. And the solution was that they're going to shift to coal. And again, this is an accident of geography. The British Isles were just sitting on a gigantic pool of coal, unlike India or unlike China, for example. Again, so coal is going to be instrumental for the development of the steel industry in Great Britain. Again, steel production. This is a more efficient fuel system that is going to produce higher temperatures, and it burns slower than wood, and you can smelt iron ore and you can liquefy it and you can turn it into anything you want. So all the machinery created by the British, the railroads, the tracks, the locomotives, the steam engines, the factories, etc., all of that came from the steel plants because they had coal at their disposal. Again, so this was really, again, an accident of geography. And the transition towards coal, by the way, created a true fuel revolution in Great Britain. Again, this is not just a matter of, well, we just transitioned into a new source of energy. And so, again, this has absolutely no consequences as a matter of fact. No, it does has serious consequences, again, in human history. Fuel has been essential across human history for the production of food, clothing, shelter, and fuel. Previously, prior to the Industrial Revolution, when we look, for example, at the rise of agricultural civilizations, about 3 or 4,000 BC, and even prior to that, again, with the beginning of early farming practices, perhaps 10,000 BC, how people actually went about, producing food, clothing, shelter, and fuel. Again, it was mainly through the capture of solar energy. Again, this was known as the old biological regime. The old biological regime is that the way people generated all the needed energy to produce what needed to be produced in society, that it came from the sun. For example, the crops. The crops come from the sun annually, every year. They grow because of the energy, the solar energy. The animals, for example, that people consume and hunt, etc., they feed upon also vegetation, and the vegetation comes from the sun, and also the wood. And the wood also is produced, of course, by the sun. And you free up, of course, when you burn wood, you free up solar energy that is stored in the wood as well. When it comes to work, again, everything again was done manually. It was human and animal muscle as well. Again, this is the biological old regime, and it had its own limitations. A lot, I should say, limitations to it. Okay, the economy cannot grow beyond what the biological regime imposed on you in terms of what you can actually extract from nature. But what the British created was a true fuel revolution, again, that gave rise to a new biological regime in which instead of relying entirely on the annual flow of solar energy and animal and human muscle, now uh, everything will be produced through the fuel obtained from fossils. In this case, coal initially. And as we're going to be moving into the 1800s, again, that will be oil as well. Fossil fuel. Okay. They're going to be powering up the machines, the steam engines, for example, the industries, the factories. So they're going to be manufacturing everything from textiles, for example, the iron ore, the steel, the production of crops. We're going to see mechanized, again, tractors, for example, again, for the production of crops as well, food in general. Again, so everything that needs to be produced will be produced by releasing the energy from fossils. And of course, this is going to have an environmental impact. The environmental impact is that this is going to lead to pollution, massive pollution. As we're burning fossil fuels, again, we're going to be polluting the air, the water, and of course the land by releasing, again, greenhouse gases, of course, into the atmosphere. So uh, again, so there is, of course, an environmental cost to transition towards fossil fuels. Again, this is the new biological regime, as it is called. And so this is why it's considered also revolutionary. All right. So part 4 is going to look at political revolutions that gave rise to liberal democracy and popular sovereignty. Once again, we're going to see also a dramatic change in the way people organize their societies politically. Previously, prior to the emergence of liberal democracy and popular sovereignty, in which people will have a say in the political order, people lived under the old feudal order in which power was stored mainly in 3 types of institutions: the monarchy, ruled by, of course, a king; an aristocracy, a group of landed elite landlords; and of course, the church. Again, for the most part, I mean, this is really, again, in Europe. But when you look around the world, it is almost something akin to this. There's always a chief, a leader, an emperor, a prince, again, that is in charge, and he has with him a series of landlords, again, noblemen, again, that share power with him, protect the king, fight for the king, and of course the priests as well. They exert significant power. And power, again, was concentrated in that selected group of people. Kings in Europe were absolute. Again, they believed that their power emanated from the divine. This is called divine rights of kings, in other words. That power doesn't come from the people, it comes from God, in other words. And as such, the king, the aristocracy, and the church really enjoyed a lot of privileges, particularly economic privileges. For example, the privilege of controlling land, for example, and labor. That privilege was inherited by birth. Again, so this is what really an aristocratic society is all about. Again, aristocratic society is one in which individuals inherit their social position by birth. So again, the aristocracy, the kings and members of the church will continue to rule by virtue of inheriting rights and privileges. The rights to control the population, to demand tribute from them, crops, labor, for example. And at the same time, uh, they're going to uh, enjoy certain monopolies when it comes to the economy as well. They're going to be controlling the economy and also the religious sphere as well, particularly the church. Then they will be controlling, for the most part, religious education, for example, ceremonies, rituals, and the collection of tribute, tithes, for example. Okay, so again, this is the old feudal order, and people were not really going about questioning the order, but rather this was established by the divine. This is the way it has to be, and so on. Now, that kind of order will be questioned and challenged in a series of uprisings or wars or revolutions. We're going to be looking at two of them. One is going to be a civil war that took place in England between 1640 and 1648. This is, again, the very first democratic revolution, again, that is going to give rise to, again, liberal democracy and popular sovereignty. Here, the situation starts with a monarch, Charles I, who is, again, ruling England and Scotland simultaneously, and he's part of the Stuart dynasty, and they're mainly Catholic, by the way, ruling over a Protestant society. So that was problematic to begin with. Now, there's also a parliament. It's supposed to be another branch of government, but it's not really powerful. It is more of a kind of a deal-making body of the nobility. In other words, this is really like a forum for the nobles, the landlords, to meet with the king and negotiate deals, in other words. So again, this is not really the seat of government. Prior to this time, it's just a deal-making body. Whenever the king needed money, taxes, they will cut deals with the members of the nobility, and they will both benefit from the deal, and that was it. And it rarely met. Again, this is not a parliament that met continuously in order to legislate. Again, that's not how it functioned in the past. Okay, it rarely met, in other words. Now, England is going through a lot of changes economically. This is part of the reasons why they're going to go through the political revolution. They, for example, have a rising merchant class, a result of the commercial revolution, international trade. We see a new group on the rise, and they do have a lot of resources, economic resources, wealth, in other words, investment, and so on. The problem is they don't have political power. They don't have a voice in the state because power is monopolized, in other words, okay, by the institutions that I just described. Feudalism was in crisis. That's another part of the problem, that the old feudal order, in which people are simply collecting tribute from peasants, that was in crisis as a result of the silver revolution. Now that silver is becoming money, now the landlords are demanding the peasants can to pay tribute in the form of rents. In other words, a fixed amount of silver to be paid to the landlord. But because there's just so much silver flooding the British economy, again, this is inflating prices, in Britain. So because the rents are fixed, then the monies that the landlords are receiving is really not enough because they're getting paid a certain amount of money every year that is fixed, and while the prices are going up again, so that payment again is totally meaningless. So the solution to the problem, according to the landlords, was to evict the peasants from the land and enclose it, in other words, and turn it into private property so they can make profit. Moving sheep to produce wool, so they can sell the wool to the emerging manufacturing plants of England, for example, so they can make a profit, in other words. So they're moving to the market, in other words, while they're evicting the peasants. And so this was part of the Silver Revolution that is creating a crisis, really an economic crisis, again, in which, for the most part, uh, peasants, farmers, are going to be targeted, in other words, because they're losing all their entitlements to the land and they're now landless, in other words. And so, of course, this creates discontent and outrage among the farmers. And we're going to see a growing group of people known as the diggers. They want reform. They're being evicted from the lands by the commercial landlords now. They're moving into capitalism now. And they're trying to battle the enclosure movement. They're trying to get rid of the landlords. They're trying to create a new type of society in which the peasants will own the land collectively. They want something called communal land holdings. The farmers will be in charge of the land and they will own the land in common, in other words. That kind of will make it impossible for them to be evicted, in other words, out of the land. So they, in a certain sense, want to restore the old order in which the peasants had connections and entitlements to the land. And in many cases, they were making accusations to the landlords for abuses that they suffered. And there was an institution in England, otherwise known as the Star Chamber. This is, again, something that the King of England instituted in order to limit the power of the landlords. The Star Chamber is where the peasants will complain, file complaints against landlords, and more peasants are turning to the Star Chamber to accuse landlords of abuses, mainly that they're being evicted from their lands, etc. And this is going to lead to a crisis as well in England, just because in England the Star Chamber could not reveal the names of the peasants to the landlord whenever the landlords were accused of abuses, for example. Again, in England, this is going to be problematic because the landlords cannot face their accusers, in other words. Okay, but the king used that system in order to limit the power, once again, of the landlord. Another issue is that there is a struggle, a tension in England between merchants. The small merchants, the independent merchants, are growing resentful at the fact that there's just a handful of merchants that are dominating the international trading system in England, that they have a virtual monopoly of trade, like the British East India Company. They're moving into the Indian Ocean, and they do not allow the participation of small merchants in trade. So again, this is going to also lead to a growing discontent among the merchant class as well. Again, landlords, peasants, merchants are becoming quite agitated again at all of the changes that are transpiring inside of England as a result of, again, international trade and capitalism. There's also religious upheaval. The Protestant groups, such as the Puritans, are trying to reform the Anglican Church. They feel that the Anglican Church is very much like the Catholic Church, and they want to uproot all the Catholic elements and practices from the church. So this is another group that is going to grow discontent because they're trying to eliminate the ceremonialism of the Anglican Church that is very akin to the Catholic Church. They want to totally reform it and turn it into a more Protestant kind of church. And they want to emphasize individual religious experience, in other words. Okay. So they are trying to bring the Reformation to England, and they're now battling one of the institutions that the king protects. Remember, the church. Again, they are in charge of society. And now there's a growing group that is battling the church in this case. They want to eliminate the church hierarchy, the Puritans, and institute democratic control of the church. In other words, that the people will be in charge. In other words, not the hierarchy. Puritan supporters, such as the Levelers, again, this is a growing political group that is somewhat affiliated to the Puritans. They are trying to transfer religious democracy to the political order, meaning the Puritans are also the forerunners of democracy in England because they want to democratize the church. They want to put the church in the hands of the people, in other words. But followers of the Puritans want to transfer that kind of religious democracy to the political order. They want freedom of speech, they want an expanded suffrage, and also religious tolerance. So again, people are talking about reform now. They want democracy. They want people to have a say in the political order. And this is going to lead to a political crisis. Again, Charles I, who believes that his power came from God, is trying to centralize authority. He's battling many forces, in other words. And he's denying merchants' participation in trade. He's denying any reform in the church. And he's going to lead to a confrontation with his own countrymen in Scotland. He's going to face a massive rebellion as he's trying to centralize power. He faced a rebellion. And in order to deal with the rebellion, he needs to put it down. He needs to send a massive force to Scotland to put it down. So he calls upon Parliament, this deal-making body, to make a deal with him to get the monies he needed to put down the rebellion. And while he's trying to make a deal, the merchants, the landlords, many of them are now capitalists, in other words, they want a say in the government. In other words, okay, let's cut a deal, but we want reform. We want Parliament to share power with the king. We want the Parliament to be a true branch of government. Okay, we want the power to tax, and we also want the power to legislate and govern, in other words. Okay, so again, Charles doesn't have time to listen to all those petitions. He is the absolute ruler, and he executes the prime minister and all of the subversives. There's a lot of people that are questioning the authority of King Charles, people that refuse to pay the taxes, people that question his authority will face consequences like, for example, some of them will be in prison, some of them will be put to death, and others, their property will be confiscated. So this is very important. Their property is confiscated. He's not respecting private property. So that led to the Civil War. This is a civil war between the Parliament, controlled by the merchants, and the monarchy, represented by the old feudal order, the church, members of the old nobility, and the like. The Parliament gets the support of the merchants, the growing capitalists, the Puritans, and also farmers. So there's a coalition of forces that want to bring about change and reform in the system. People that want to have a say, a political voice in the government, in other words, for legislation, for voting, for example, free speech, you name it, control of land, and so on, private property. They want, again, a new order, a new liberal order in this case, again. And again, the war will rage on for about 8 years, and Charles I will suffer defeat. He'll be captured and executed by members of parliament in 1649. Okay, so this is the very first time in world history that we see a popular upheaval disrupting a monarchy in a very serious way. Now, of course, monarchs in the past have been ousted, deposed, often by members of the nobility, etc. Again, those were minor instances, but this was a popular manifestation. It's a massive, again, popular upheaval that is disrupting, again, monarchy. So after this, we see a transition stage, otherwise known as the Commonwealth of England, in which we see a kind of dictatorship. This is one of the leaders of Parliament, Oliver Cromwell, is named as the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England. He becomes the chief executive of the British Commonwealth, and he brings about the reforms to bring about a new liberal state, again, in England, a secular order, separation of church and state, first and foremost. Again, what that means is that the church is not going to persecute dissidents. Again, there will be religious tolerance. In other words, there will be Protestants in control of their own churches. There will be no imposition of dogma and doctrine. In other words, there's a declaration of private property. Again, that is really accelerating the enclosure movement. That now merchants will have the rights to own their own property. That the king cannot confiscate, in other words, your assets, your property, your land, your wealth. If you have ships, warehouses, land, etc., that is going to be yours, in other words. Okay, so this is, again, really bringing about the beginnings of also of capitalism as well, private property. Trade with Americas is liberalized, meaning that those small merchants that wanted to gain access to foreign trade, they're giving access to the American colonies, not with India, but rather in America. Now, there will be opportunities to invest in trading operations and trading companies in the New World. And that kind of ease the tensions between, again, the small merchants and the large merchants. So, again, we see a more liberal economy, so to speak, that is freeing up the system, if you will, for more and more participation of other groups. We see the protection of landowners and parliament by the suppression of radicals like the diggers, for example, and the levelers. So Oliver Cromwell, again, pretty much institutes a true dictatorship in that he is really going against, dissidents that really want to push for further reforms in England. Okay, the legacy of the English Civil War is that we see now a parliamentary system of government. Parliament is now the government. The monarchy is still there, but it's more of a symbol, a figurehead that is really not really in charge of legislation and taxes. Now Parliament is. It's an elected body. Again, it has a House of Commons to represent the people and a House of Lords to represent the wealthy, in other words. They also implement a Bill of Rights in 1689, granting, of course, the rights of citizens, what today we call life, liberty, and property. This is something that the British philosopher John Locke wrote about in his treatise on government, this natural rights philosophy indicating that people have certain inherent rights given to them by nature. The right to life, liberty, and property, and the function of government is to protect those rights. He's really mainly talking about merchants, by the way, and property owners, that the function of government is to protect, again, the life, liberty, and property of the land owning elite and the merchant class, in other words. Okay. The other revolution that was part of this upheaval was the French Revolution that erupted much later in 1789. Here we also have a king quite full of hubris, just like Charles I. He was Louis XVI, who also ruled along a kind of parliament. But in France, this quote unquote parliament was very, very different. It was called the Estates General. It was made up by the representatives of the nobility, the church, and the commoners. And the nobility and the church exerted a lot of power in the Estates General. They always voted together. Each one had one vote, in other words, and they always overwhelmed the commoners. So again, this was a very undemocratic kind of system in which always the nobility and the church, which were really the minority, always carried out the day in every kind of legislation, mainly dealing with taxes, tribute, for example, that benefit, of course, the monarchy, the nobility, and the church at the expense of the commoners. And of course, France was also experiencing economic problems, a crumbling economy. The peasantry was burdened, for example. When we moved, for example, into the 1770s and early 1780s, just years before the revolution, the peasantry was really burdened by the growing feudal dues imposed by the lords, the landlords. They were trying to extract as much tribute from the peasantry, both in the form of rents paid with monies again, and also with crops, things that they produce as well. And if you fail to pay those tributes, that will generate a debt, an accruing debt, in other words. So the following year, you will have to pay your taxes that you failed to pay the previous years. So again, this really was accumulating a lot of debt, among the peasantry. We see a new group of people known as the nouveau rich, the new rich, a new land owning bourgeoisie. Again, this is really a landed elite that is more commercial, that is owning land for the sole purpose of producing cash crops for the market. This is a profit oriented, of course, system, the emergence of capitalism, and they're trying to exploit the peasants, and demanding, for example, tribute from them in terms of working the land in order to produce the product for the market, and also demanding cash payments that you have to pay a rent to live in the land as well. Again, so this is really squeezing the peasantry at the same time. The peasantry felt totally suffocated by the system due to the fact that they were experiencing simultaneously a series of droughts and crop failures year after year. Again, they're really experiencing shortages of food, so they're starving as well. Again, while again the nobility and the new landed elite is trying to extract as much wealth out of them, of course. At the same time, the crown is experiencing their own problems, their own crumbling finances when the crown decides to support the 13 colonies that were fighting Britain in the revolution. France decides to send monies to those colonies in North America to fight Great Britain out of course, rivalries between the French and the British. So they pretty much drained their own treasury. This led to a series of power struggles, similar to what happened, of course, in England. The monarchy is trying to centralize authority at the expense of the nobility by taxing the nobility, passing tax reforms to compensate for the loss of wealth, while at the same time the nobility is turning around and trying to squeeze that money from the peasantry. The monarchy is trying to build a new military controlled by the king as opposed to the nobility, to use it against the nobility as well, that required more and more money, of course, that was really trying to squeeze money again from the population. And in order to do this, of course, the king is calling the states general again for money. Again, the nobility, the church, and the commoners meet. And as they're meeting, of course, the nobility, the church vote together in favor of the new taxes, and the commoners, otherwise known as the third estate, they're known as the third estate, they explode. In other words, they decide that because they're the majority and they're being exploited by the others, they want more representation in the state. They want to create a new government. They want a national assembly, like a parliament, that they can control. Those are made up of peasants and skilled workers. They feel that they have very unequal representation in the state, and they are willing to stage, of course, a series of revolts in order to get their way. In other words, look, no, we're starving and we're being squeezed and exploited, and we want also, again, a voice in the state to have a say in taxes, in other words. So they stage a series of revolts in order to bring about a national assembly. And they conform the National Assembly as a matter of fact. And they form now a majority within the assembly. They call upon representatives from all of France, and they're meeting there to represent the commoner class, in other words. Now, the king is trying to undo the National Assembly. He harasses the National Assembly, and now the people rise up. In 1789, this leads to something called Bastille Day. They storm a prison, the Bastille, to release prisoners that were imprisoned by the king and get the weapons out of there. And they start a series of riots. They start burning churches and the manor houses of the nobility. In other words, this was a popular revolt against the nobility and the upper class, including the church. Again, so as this is occurring, the National Assembly is now building a new government, a new liberal order in France. They build a republic. Again, they institute the National Assembly as the seat of government of France. This brings an end to feudalism, the abolition of privileges of the nobility, the aristocracy, the church, the monarchy, and all feudal dues. Nobody will pay, in other words, dues anymore. Everybody is now a citizen of the republic. This is the end of the aristocracy and the beginning of the meritocracy, in other words. This is by merit. You earn your position in society by merit, by hard work, by investment, etc. Equality before the law. Everybody is equal before the law. Nobody is a nobleman. Nobody is, a special member of society. Everybody is treated equally, in other words. They also bring about civil rights by bringing about a new constitution called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, in which they provide human rights, or what is called the rights of citizen. Something similar to what happened, of course, in England with their life, liberty, and property, that those must be protected, not by the state, in other words. At the same time, they institute a petty capitalist economy in which what they want to create is a society of small landowners in which people will be producing for the national market. And in order to do that, they're engaging in massive redistribution of lands that they're actually confiscating from the church. They're privatizing, in other words, church lands, putting it on the market for people to buy so people can produce, of course, their own goods for the market and become their own, of course, owners. The radical phase of the revolution, of course, follows when King Louis XVI is executed in 1793. He's executed because he's trying to bring foreign armies into France in order to disband the revolution, and the monarchies of Europe declare war on the revolution. Then the revolutionaries have to form a new government. It's called the Committee of Public Safety for the purpose of mobilizing the economy and the population to combat, of course, the foreign armies. Okay? Here we see a radical party called the Jacobins taking charge, and we see a dictatorship. An individual by the name of Robespierre will be now seizing power, and he's going to implement totalitarian measures to run the war and also try to create an egalitarian society. To do this, he's really calling for a national draft. So every citizen has a duty to enlist in order to fight the foreign armies, the levy en masse, it was called. Also, he's trying to create a republic of small producers. So therefore, in order to create this society of small farmers and producers made up of artisans, workers, farmers, etc., he's trying to eliminate large landowners, okay? Trying to do away with them, and also to bring about what is called a maximum of prices and trying to control inflation in the process. Again, maximum prices to control inflation. In other words, it became illegal under the law to charge more for goods such as food, clothing, and other items. Again, to try to control inflation. So to do away with those people, that were price gouging, for example, the population, particularly merchants, in other words, Robespierre instituted a reign of terror, pretty much executing merchants and peasants for violating the price controls, in other words. Okay? So what this means is that, again, even though this is a liberal democratic revolution, it kind of spiraled out of control. In the end, what we see is that as the revolutionaries were trying to build a new society out of the old one, more egalitarian, based on equality, trying to protect the population, engaging in the massive redistribution of land, they resorted to totalitarian solutions again. And so this is going to be, again, a foreshadow of later revolutions, particularly the ones that we're going to be seeing in the future, like the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, where there's, of course, the danger of modern state systems to implement totalitarian measures to implement, of course, the utopian society that they want to bring about at the expense, of course, of, harming, in this case, their own citizens. In this case, again, it all started with the French Revolution. So the summary point is that in the age of revolution, we see a series of changes. We see the rise of humanism and individualism. Again, humans are now at the center of history. They're the most important elements, again, in the world, trying to transform societies and make them better, in other words. The idea of secularism, science trying to separate the material world from the spiritual world and being concerned with the here and the now, in other words, bringing about a new science based on experience, gathering facts, that can be verified by other scientists, and use that science to control nature. This is a Faustian worldview we looked at again. That this new science was not just to know nature, but try to control it as much as possible. Again, this is part of the change. And you're trying to do that in order to create what is called progress in the world, to bring about better societies, in other words, to minimize human suffering and the like. Again, what is called progress. In this change, we also see the emergence of capitalism, that is trying to free up the economy for people to own property, create businesses, and also make a profit. Others will be selling their labor for a wage in order to make a profit as well. Again, this is something new. We see the Industrial Revolution. Again, a mechanized system of production, industries, in Great Britain, for example, with factories, etc., railroads and the like. With this, we see also political changes with the introduction of popular sovereignty, the rise of citizens in England and in France, with the radical democratic revolutions we looked at, the English Civil War and the French Revolution, that were trying to implement an egalitarian society while at the same time using the power of the state in order to bring that kind of utopian society into reality. Again, using totalitarian means, whether we're talking about Oliver Cromwell or Robespierre, again, they were using the power of the state in order to push forward those liberal reforms. Again, this is all I have for you. We conclude this topic. Coming next, we are moving into a new one that is going to deal with European colonialism. This is something we're going to be dealing when we come back next time. Thank you.